Kestrel array stood in the flat sidelight of the ring plane, and there was no night in it, ever, only the slow wheel of Solander's shadow crossing the dish farm like a hand passing over a table. I had been on the Harrow deck 11 years. In that time I signed my name to 406 documents. I remember one. The deck was a long room with a curved outer wall of viewport glass, and the glass was always full of daylight, hard and colorless, bounced up off the ice of the rings. It came in at a low angle and it lay across the consoles in bars. You worked with your hands in the light and your face in the shade of the overhead, and after a decade you stopped noticing it, except when a new intake came up the ladder and stood there blinking like a man who has walked into a church he wasn't expecting. My station was the third from the end. Signals, grade 2. What that means in plain language is that I listened to the corridor. A corridor is not a road. It is a volume of space that the traffic authority has agreed to call a road because ships pass through it, and once you have agreed to call a thing a road you must post someone at the side of it. That was Kestrel. We watched the vellum corridor from its near mouth to the drift boundary, and we kept the beacons honest, and we logged every transmission that crossed the volume whether it was addressed to us or not. Most of it was not. Most of it was con. The con drift held everything on the far side of the boundary. They were not an empire in the way the word gets used. They were a consortium, a great slow federation of mining houses and hauling combines and family registries, held together by contracts and by a shared horror of ambiguity. They wrote everything down. They had 4 separate offices for the recording of ore assay, and those offices did not speak to one another, and each considered the arrangement prudent. Their comms were the same. Everything the con broadcast carried a preamble, and the preamble told you what kind of thing you were about to hear. And if the preamble was wrong, the con assumed the message was wrong and discarded it, and filed a note about the discarding. We had their preamble table. It was in the appendix of the Decode Concordance, which is a document of 1,100 pages that no one has read, and which sits on every signals console in human space as a set of tables that a machine reads and a man does not. At 4:10 station reckoning, on a day I could not tell you anything else about, the machine read 1. The tone came in as a side lobe. That is the important part, and I want to be precise about it, because everything else follows from it, and I have listened to men be imprecise about it for a long time now. A caster does not send its signal in a single clean line. It sends a lobe, and around the lobe there are smaller lobes, weaker, splayed off the main axis like the spray around a hose. The con caster platform on the far side of the boundary was called Telon Reach. It was pointed inward at the con's own registry of ways, which is the office that maintains their navigation charts, and it was doing what a hazard caster does, which is to say it was telling its own people something. It was not aimed at us. It was not aimed anywhere near us. But Telon Reach sat close to the boundary, and the ice of the outer rings does something to a signal at grazing incidents that no one has ever modeled to my satisfaction, and one of the small lobes came across the vellum corridor at an angle of about 4 degrees and lay down on our dish farm like a hand on a shoulder. It was weak, it was legible. The preamble was an inversion. In con signal grammar, an inverted preamble is a negation. It reverses the sense of what follows. It is the difference between this way and not this way. It is the difference between come to these coordinates and do not come to these coordinates, and the con have used it for 600 years, and they consider it perfectly clear, and it is perfectly clear if you are con. 3 centuries ago, and considerably closer to home, human wreck buoys used an inverted carrier for something else. Before the standard was rationalized, a hull that was losing pressure would flip the polarity of its transponder handshake, because a flipped handshake required no power to maintain and could be triggered by the failure of the thing that had been maintaining it. It was elegant. It was the sound a ship made when it stopped being able to make any other sound. Inverted preamble, and then the ship's registry, and then coordinates. Inverted preamble, registry, coordinates. Whoever built the decode concordances cross-reference tables built them the way men build such things, which is to say by mapping the shape of one grammar onto the shape of another, and moving on to the next problem. The con inversion looked, on the page, exactly like our inversion. The table said so. The table had said so for a very long time and had never once been asked about it, because no con caster had ever leaked into a human corridor before, because the geometry did not permit it, except that on that morning at 4 degrees off axis, with the rings at the angle they were at, it did. The machine at my station read the side lobe. It found an inverted preamble. It went to the table. It came back with a word. The word came up on my screen in the same weight and the same face as every other word the machine has ever given me, which is the thing about machines that men who do not work with them fail to understand. It does not shout. It says mayday in the same gray letters it uses to say routine, and it puts the timestamp beside it, and it waits. I did not touch it for 4 seconds. I have thought about those 4 seconds more than I have thought about most of my marriage. I was not deciding anything. I was reading. There was a registry string con, a mining house, a designation that rendered as amble vault, and there was a coordinate, and the coordinate was a moon called Kesh Talon on the far side of the boundary, 11 days out at hauler pace, 4 days for anything with a proper drive. And there was a payload. The con do not send bare beacons. They append. The append was a hazard schedule, a contaminant designation, a particle size, a lung clearance figure, and a period of validity that ran, in our reckoning, for a little over 200 years. I called the watch supervisor. Her name was Adeline Frey, and she had been on Kestrel longer than I had, and she came down the deck with her sleeves pushed up and stood behind my chair with one hand on the seat back and read it twice. "That's a long validity for a mayday," she said. "It is. Ships don't stay in distress for 200 years. "No, ma'am." She stood there. The light came up off the rings and lay in a bar across the console and across the backs of her hands. "Run it against the raw," she said. We ran it against the raw. The raw was the side lobe itself, unparsed, and it was a weak, dirty, beautiful thing, and there was nothing in it that told either of us anything, because neither of us spoke con, because no one at Kestrel spoke con, because the con did not talk to us. In 11 years the drift had addressed Kestrel array exactly twice, both times to complain about a survey ship's transponder power. "Forward it," Frey said. I want to be clear that this was correct. I have heard since a great deal about what Kestrel should have done, most of it from men who have never sat at a console and had a machine hand them a word. Frey did the correct thing. A station warrant does not adjudicate a distress call. He does not weigh it. He does not stand at his console at 4 in the morning and decide, on the strength of a validity period that struck him as odd, that a signal the table has called a mayday is not one. He forwards it with the raw attached, and he notes the anomaly, and he lets it go up. I noted the anomaly. I want that on the record too, and it is, in fact, on the record in the second field of my forwarding note, in language I chose carefully and have not stopped hearing since. Validity period inconsistent with distress. Recommend drift liaison confirmation prior to asset commitment. Then I forwarded it, and it went up the chain to Meridian, which is where the fleet keeps the people who decide things, and I went and drank a cup of tea in the mess with my back to the window and my hands around the cup, because the Harrow deck runs cold no matter what the light looks like. The answer came back in 19 hours. That is not slow. I have heard it called slow. It is not. In 19 hours, a staff at Meridian pulled the concordance appendix and pulled the drift standing quarantine registry, which we hold a copy of and which the drift has never once updated in our favor, and found Kesh Talon on it, and found that the drift had declared the moon sealed under its own instruments 11 days prior, and found that the drift had committed no vessel of its own, and found that the sealing carried a 200-year hazard validity, and drew the only conclusion available to a staff officer, with a duty of care to his crews. They also, and this is the part that is never quoted, sent a query to the Drift's liaison office. The query asked, in the flat courteous phrasing that such queries use, whether the transmission logged at Kestrel constituted a request for assistance. The Drift liaison office did not reply. It did not reply for 9 days. It replied, eventually, on the 9th day, and by then the 9th day was the only day anybody cared about. So Meridian answered without them. The answer came down to Kestrel because Kestrel was the receiving station, and the log had to close where it opened. It came as a signals instruction, 4 lines, and it went into the log under my hand because I had the watch. Transmission at 4:10 assessed as hazard broadcast, not distress. Quarantine sovereign to Drift authority. No asset committed. Kestrel to acknowledge and close. I have typed a great many things. I typed that. And then, because a signals instruction is not a thing that exists until a warrant signs the receipt, I signed the receipt, and the machine put my name at the bottom of it, Rusk, E, grade 2, and the timestamp, and the log closed. Request declined. I have never been able to make anyone understand that I agreed with it. I agree with it now. Somebody has to be able to say no. A navy that goes wherever a table points it is not a navy. It is a weather vane. And there is a version of this story where a rescue squadron burned 4 days at full load into a sovereign quarantine on the strength of a mistranslated preamble and killed 900 of its own people on a contaminated rock for nothing. And in that version of the story, I am the man who let it happen because I did not have the spine to note the anomaly. Meridian was right. Frey was right. I was right. There was only the small matter of the 4,000 people under the seal. Nobody at Kestrel knew that. I want to say that plainly. We did not know there was anyone alive under the seal, because a hazard broadcast in Con grammar does not carry a headcount, because to the registry of ways a sealed volume has no interior. That is not cruelty. It is filing. Once a volume is sealed, it is a hazard, and a hazard is described by its extent and its validity and its particle size. And if you were to ask the registry of ways how many people were inside a hazard, the clerk would tell you, with genuine bewilderment, that the hazard does not have people in it. The hazard has a boundary, and the people are on one side of the boundary or the other, and the ones on the inside are, administratively, part of the hazard. I learned that later. I learned all of this later. At the time I signed the receipt, closed the log, went off watch, and slept for 6 hours in the flat, unending daylight of the ring plain with a folded jacket over my eyes. 14 hours before I signed, an ore hauler called Marrow Lane had entered the near mouth of the Vellum corridor on a nitrogen run, outbound, riding low with a hold full of nothing. I did not know the ship. There is no reason I would have. 300 haulers a year come through the corridor, and they are, to a signals warrant, transponder codes and mass declarations, and the occasional complaint about beacon drift. Marrow Lane was 90 years old. She was a bulk hull with a spine, 4 grapples, a hold you could have parked a chapel in, and an Isendor rating that meant she was permitted to carry things that did not care whether they were kept at pressure. She had a crew of 9. Her master was a woman named Inez Cabia, who was 44 years old, who had bought the ship at auction with a syndicate of 5 other haulers, and had spent 11 years buying out the other 5, and who had, that year, 4 payments left. I have read her deposition perhaps 30 times. It is not a long document. She was not an eloquent woman, and she did not try to be. It is the flattest piece of writing I have ever encountered, and I would put it in front of anyone who wants to know what we are. Marrow Lane carried an old receiver. Not a bad one, a good one, in its day, and its day had been 60 years ago. Haulers do not replace receivers. A receiver that works, works. And a hauler's receiver carries a decode table, and a hauler's decode table is not the concordance. It is a stripped commercial subset, and the commercial subset is updated when the owner pays for the update, and the owner had 4 payments left on the ship. Her table was older than mine. It made the same mistake mine made. It made it worse because the commercial subset does not carry hazard schedule parsing at all. It carried the preamble. It carried the registry. It carried the coordinate. Then it hit the append and found a field it did not understand and dropped it on the floor. The way software has always dropped things on the floor, silently, in the certainty that nothing important could possibly be down there. So Cabia did not see a 200-year validity period. She did not see a particle size or a lung clearance figure. She saw an inverted preamble and a registry string and a coordinate. She saw a ship that had stopped being able to make any other sound. Her watch officer that morning was a man named Thomas Salen, and it was Salen who called her up out of her bunk, and it is Salen's account that fills the gap in hers, because she does not describe herself and he does. He says she came up in a shirt and stood at the receiver and looked at it and did not sit down. He says she asked him one question, which was whether the coordinate was inside the corridor. It was not. It was 4 days off the corridor, across the boundary in the drift. He says she asked a second question, which was whether anyone had answered. Salen checked the corridor traffic band. There were 4 ships in the volume. Nobody was talking. Kestrel's beacon was doing what Kestrel's beacon does, which is to say the alphabet slowly forever into the dark. He says she stood there for a while. He does not say how long. Then she said, and this is in his statement and hers, and they do not contradict each other, which is worth something. It's an inverted handshake. That's not a thing you send. That's a thing that happens to you. And then she asked him what they had in the hold. The answer was nothing. They were outbound and empty. What they had for themselves. 40 tons of water ice in the ballast tanks, because a hauler ballasts with ice and sells the ice if the ice is worth more than the ballast. A hold that could be pumped down and blown out and run at any pressure you liked. 4 filtration cartridges for the hold scrubbers, plus a crate of 11 spares that Cabia had bought 2 years earlier because a man in a yard had sold them cheap, and she had a hauler's superstition about scrubbers. And 9 people, one of whom was a hull welder who had been a paramedic in a colony service for 6 years before she decided she preferred metal. They had no weapons. Haulers do not carry weapons. They had no medical bay, no isolation ward, no decontamination lock, no legal standing whatsoever on the far side of a sovereign boundary, and no earthly business going there. Salen asked her what she wanted to do. Cabia's deposition on this point is 1 sentence, and it is the sentence that a drift advocate later read aloud in a hearing chamber as though it were a confession, which, in fairness, it was. I told him to put us on the coordinate. Haveth Sir was hazard warden of Telon Reach, 3rd grade, with 18 years of service, and a commendation for the reduction of caster power drift. I have met him. That comes later. I mention it now because I want the reader to understand that when I describe what he did I am not guessing, and I am also not indulging in the vice of my profession, which is to imagine that the alien on the other end of a signal is a version of ourselves with a different face. Haveth Sir was not a version of me. He was a man who had spent 18 years making sure that a beam went where it was supposed to go, and who understood the moral universe as a set of boundaries correctly drawn, and who would have found the phrase moral universe embarrassing and imprecise. He had cast the seal on Kesh Talon 11 days before I read it. He did not decide to cast it. Nobody decided to cast it. Amble Vault was a deep working, a lithic mine 4 kilometers down under the moon's crust, and something in the 8th gallery had opened onto a bed of what the Khan call sift, a dust of long fibrous crystal, kicked up dry, that does not settle and does not dissolve and does not stop, and that goes into a Khan lung the way a burr goes into wool and stays there for the rest of the wool's life. The assay office logged the sift. The logging of the sift triggered the hazard schedule. The hazard schedule went to the registry of ways. The registry issued a seal. The seal was transmitted to Telon Reach for casting. Haveth Sir aligned the caster, confirmed the preamble inversion, confirmed the coordinate, confirmed the 200-year validity, and fired it inward at his own registry so that every con chart in the drift would update within the day and every con hull would route around the moon for 2 centuries. He fired a warning, in his own language, at his own people. It was the most correct thing he did all year, and he did it with the small satisfaction a man takes in a clean alignment, and he logged the power figure, and he went to eat. Under the seal, in the galleries and the pressure town and the 4 levels of habitation cut into the rock above the 8th gallery, there were something over 4,000 miners and their families, and they were not dying of the sift, most of them, not yet, because the sift was in the 8th gallery and the 8th gallery had been closed. What they were doing was running out of filtration. A sealed volume receives nothing. That is what sealed means. It is not a punishment and it is not an abandonment in con law. It is a description. Nothing goes in because the hazard is inside, and a hull that enters a hazard is a hull that leaves it, and a hull that leaves a hazard carries the hazard out. The drift did not send ships to Kesh Talen for the same reason a man does not put his hand in a fire to retrieve his glove. An amble vault called. Of course it called. It called on the house band, and it called on the registry band, and it called on the emergency band, and every call was received, and every call was logged, and every log noted that the transmission originated from within a sealed volume, and a transmission from within a sealed volume is a hazard transmission, and hazard transmissions are filed. 4,000 people spent 11 days shouting into an office that had already written down what they were. Haveth Sir knew none of this either at first. He was a caster warden. He had fired a seal. He did not know how many people were on the wrong side of it because the seal did not have that field. On the 12th day, his board showed a hull crossing the boundary. It was not on any chart he had. It was not squawking a drift registry. It was slow, appallingly slow, a mass profile like a moving hill, a drive signature that his board classified as industrial, obsolete, non-military, and it was going on a course as straight as a ruled line directly at Kesh Talen. He did what any warden would do. He recast the seal, aimed properly this time, right down the throat of the incoming hull. Full power. Inverted preamble, registry, coordinate, hazard schedule, validity. Do not approach, do not approach, do not approach. And on Marrow Lane. 90 years old, with 4 payments left, an old receiver took a beautiful clean signal at full strength, dropped the hazard schedule on the floor because it did not have the field, and put 4 gray words on Inez Cabia's screen. The word said, distress, repeated, closing. Saylan's statement says she read it and closed her eyes for a moment. Then she said, he's still talking. 12 days and he's still talking. Get me every cartridge we own out of the crate. They pumped down the hold. They blew it out to vacuum and let the light in through the open doors and swept the ore dust out of the corners with brooms. 9 people in suits with brooms, and they ran the scrubbers up and set the fresh cartridges in and pressurized it clean. And by the time Marrow Lane came over Kesh Talen, she had, in her belly, the largest sealed clean volume within 4 days of that moon in any direction. And she had it because she was empty, and she was empty because she was poor. Haveth Sir watched her come. He recast the seal twice more. He escalated to the registry of ways and received in return an acknowledgement and a case number. He signaled the hull on every band the drift possessed. He was not at that point alarmed. He was affronted. A hull was ignoring a hazard. Hulls did not ignore hazards. He assumed a malfunction and he logged the assumption. He also, being a thorough man, ran the hull's drive signature against the liaison registry and got a match, and read the words human, commercial, bulk carrier, and read the name, and did not know what a marrow was or a lane. Then Marrow Lane went into orbit around a sealed moon and opened her doors. I was asleep for the first 2 days of it. That is not modesty, it is chronology. Kestrel closed the log. When a log closes, the corridor stops looking. I sat my watches and I ran my dishes and I logged the beacon drift and somewhere across the boundary, A woman I had never heard of was standing in a cargo hold in a soft suit with a hand light, taking people aboard in 50s. She could not decontaminate them. She had nothing to do it with. What she had was a hold, and a hold has a door on each end. What she did, and she explains it in the deposition in the tone of a woman explaining how to reeve a block, because to her it was that, it was rigging, it was the trade was to run the hold as a lock. Down at the surface, a shuttle there's con, driven by a con pit foreman who had decided on his own authority that the seal did not apply to a hull that was already inside it. Up to the hold. Doors shut. Blow the hold to vacuum hard, and the sift is fibrous and dry and light, and it goes with the air, most of it, and what does not go, the scrubbers take, and the cartridges load up with it and clog and die and get thrown out the door into the dark. Repressurize. Move them forward through the spine into the crew spaces, and the crew spaces are, by then, holding 9 people and 200 strangers, and every soft surface has been stripped and stowed because fiber catches in soft surfaces. Then do it again. The paramedic turned welder. Her name was Ruth Ivanovna Palmy, and she is, in her way, the reason any of this ended as it did, worked out on the second run that the cartridges were dying faster than they had any right to, and worked out why, and had the crew break out the ballast ice. 40 tons of water ice in the tanks. They let it into the hold as a fog on the down cycle, and the fog took the fiber out of the air and fell with it, and they swept the hold floor with brooms into bags, and the bags went out the door with the cartridges, and the ice went down and down until Marrow Lane had no ballast, and a hauler with no ballast handles like a barn door in a wind, and Cabya flew her that way for 6 days. The con and the hold did not understand what was happening to them. This is in the Drift's own inquiry record, which they published, eventually, because the con publish everything, and reading it is like reading a report of a haunting. Deponent states that the vessel was not of the Drift. Deponent states that no announcement was made. Deponent states that a human female indicated by gesture that he should walk forward. Deponent states that the humans did not appear to be attempting to remove the hazard from him, but rather to remove him from the hazard, and that he does not know how to record this distinction in the form provided. On the 4th day the cartridges ran out. There were no more. There had been 15 and there were none. Marrow Lane stayed anyway. 9 more people came aboard the day after the last cartridge died, and then no more, because Cabya stood in the hold with the pit foreman and a translator slate that could manage about 200 words and told him, with the slate and with her hands, that if she took another load she would kill the one she had. The Drift record notes that the human master then remained in orbit for 5 additional days without taking on further personnel, and that the reason for this delay could not be established. I can establish it. She was waiting for somebody to come. She had a hold full of con who could not go back down and could not be carried across a boundary into human space, because a human port would put a sealed hull in quarantine, and a con lung does not have 4 months, and she had no ballast, and she had no filters, and she had a course home she could not fly. She sat over that moon for 5 days with her doors shut and her drive cold and her transponder up, waiting for the Drift to send something, anything, a tender, a barge, a single medical hull, because there were 4,000 people down there and she had taken off a number I will not put in this account, because the number gets quoted, and when the number gets quoted people do arithmetic with it, and there is no arithmetic to do. And on the far side of the boundary, in the Castor House on Telun Reach, Havath Sur filed the 7th recast of a hazard beacon that a human hull was ignoring, and then he did the thing that he did, which is the reason I have met him, and which is the reason I am writing any of this down. He went and got the human decode table. There was a copy. There is always a copy. The Drift's liaison office had held a copy of the Decode Concordance Appendix for 140 years, unread, in the way that offices hold things, and Haveth Sir requisitioned it on a form, and waited 2 days for the form to clear and read it at a desk in flat daylight through a dome of dirty glass with his hands flat on the paper. He found the inversion table. He found the mapping. He found, printed in a human hand 3 centuries dead, that his preamble, the one he had aligned and fired and logged with a small, clean satisfaction 18 days before, meant, in the tongue of the species now sitting in orbit around his quarantine, "I am dying, and I have no power left to tell you so." The drift inquiry contains his statement. It is 4 lines long. The con do not editorialize. I recast the hazard 6 times at increasing power. Each recast was received. Each recast was understood by the receiving vessel as a repetition of a distress call from a failing hull. My warnings were the reason the vessel did not leave. I was the signal that kept them there. I have that in the original and in 3 translations, and none of them are better than that. Then, because he was who he was, Haveth Sir took the matter to the registry of ways with the human table in his hand, and the registry heard him, and the registry ruled correctly, under its own instruments. And I have never been able to make a human audience accept that the word correctly belongs in this sentence. But it does. That the misapprehension of a foreign vessel did not alter the status of a sealed volume, that the volume remained a hazard, that the hull in orbit was now itself within the hazard, and therefore itself a hazard, and that no drift asset would be committed. The registry filed the ruling and issued a case number. Haveth Sir, Hazard Warden, 3rd grade, 18 years of service, commended for the reduction of caster power drift, went back to Telun Reach and did not recast the seal. He shut the caster down. It was not an act of rebellion. He was very clear about that afterward, and he was clear about it in a tone that suggested he could not understand why anyone kept asking. A caster fires a warning. The warning was, to the only vessel receiving it, a plea. He could not fire a plea at people who were already dying of having answered one. So he shut it down, and he logged the shutdown, and he entered as his justification a phrase that the registry's clerks did not have a field for and eventually entered under equipment fault. He wrote, "The instrument was saying something I did not mean."